I love that video. Hi, good evening. I'm Lynette Clementson, and I'm the director of the Wallace House Center for Journalists here at the university. Tonight's event is part of an ongoing series hosted as a partnership between Wallace House, the Ford School, and Democracy in Debate. The series with Democracy in Debate is called Democracy in Crisis, Views from the Press. I think some of you have participated in other events that we've had as part of this series. We actually started the series when we were doing virtual events. And so it's nice to be able to gather in a room to continue these conversations. Launched in 2022, this series features award-winning journalists and their insights into the forces threatening our country's democratic systems and explores the role of the press in upholding democratic institutions. After tonight, our next event as part of this series will feature the journalist Chris Wallace, who, as some of you may know, is the son of Mike Wallace, which is where the Wallace House name comes from. And we'll be inviting Chris here in March for a special event, so stay tuned for information about that. Thank you to our media partners for this evening, Detroit Public Television and PBS Books. We appreciate your support and your reach and your belief in how journalism fits into the public mission. So tonight, after our conversation, we're going to move to a Q&A. You can ask your question by standing at mics that will be in the aisles here. And for those following us on social media, you can tweet your question to us with the hashtag Wallace House, and somebody will be monitoring on social media. So, here with me on stage tonight, I am thrilled to welcome Jelani Cobb here to the University of Michigan. Jelani is Dean of the Columbia Journalism School. He's a staff writer at The New Yorker, where he writes about race, politics, history, and culture. He's the author of The Substance of Hope, Barack Obama and the Paradox of Progress, and one of my early favorites, To the Break of Dawn, a freestyle on the hip-hop aesthetic. He's a producer or co-producer of a number of documentaries, including Lincoln's Dilemma, Obama in Pursuit of a More Perfect Union, and Policing the Police. Jelani was educated at Jamaica High School in Queens, New York. He went to Howard University, where he earned his BA in English, and when I met him, he was at Rutgers, where he completed his MA and his doctorate in American history. So sometimes I have these conversations with our guest, and tonight I really wanted to invite Jelani to be in conversation with a close partner of mine here at the university, Celeste Watkins-Hayes, the interim dean of the Ford School of Public Policy. Dr. Watkins-Hayes is founding director of the Ford School's Center for Racial Justice, and she's a professor of sociology. She's an internationally recognized scholar and an expert on the intersection of inequality, public policy, and institutions, with a special focus on urban poverty and race, class, and gender studies. I want to point out, I said that Jelani was a graduate of Howard, and Dr. Watkins-Hayes is a graduate of Spelman, so I want to just take a moment here to give a shout out to HBCUs. And she has her PhD and MA in sociology from Harvard. So, somebody asked me earlier today, well, why would you invite the dean of another university to come here and talk to us? And I said, well, let me tell you. Jelani became dean of the Columbia School of Journalism in August. He's been at Columbia for a while, and for me as a journalist, Jelani occupies a special place in our culture. There are few people who are fully scholars and fully regarded as scholars and fully journalists and fully regarded and respected as journalists. He can move through both of those spaces, talk to people in each space, equally and make people in those two spaces understand one another, which actually isn't an easy or natural thing to do. I've been following his work for years. He's been here now for over 24 hours, and just a day in his presence here leaves me feeling invigorated and inspired. And so I know that you all will leave here invigorated and inspired too. So I'm going to turn the podium over to Dr. Celeste Watkins-Hayes, and when we get to the question part of the event, I will look forward to you all joining the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lynette. Thank you so much, Lynette, and good evening to everyone. And we are so delighted to be here, to be in conversation together. So welcome.
Thank you.
Jelani Cobb. So,
am I on? Okay, all right, thank you.
So I want to ask you, we are sitting in front of a visual that says the half-life of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
What is the half-life of freedom?
So in addition to being the working title of a book that I'm in the midst of writing, so it's like advanced publicity. Really, we have this sense of freedom as being, in the United States, the very facile idea of freedom as being a permanent state of affairs. And, that title was meant to be provocative because when we talk about the half-life of, in element, it's how long it takes for half of it to decay. And so when we're looking at the assaults on democracy and the assaults on freedom, I wanted us to think about it in that way, and even our concept of democracy is skewed in particular ways. If you ask most people when American democracy begins, they'll say 1776. But I have the radical contention that you can't be a democracy while buying and selling human beings. So you have to push that out to 1865. But by that point, you have stopped the habit of buying and selling human beings, but you still have not enfranchised more than half of the population. Black people can't vote, Native Americans can't vote, women can't vote. And so, the successive waves of movements that had to happen that get the right to vote for women, secure the right to vote for women, secure the right to vote for black men in the 15th Amendment, although that's a right that is rapidly revoked in the South. And so it's really not until 1965 that the country can actually call itself a democracy. And so if we look at it in that context, we see freedom as a much more fragile state than we typically think of it as.
Mm-hmm. And as we all know, in the last couple of years, there have been real concerns about threats to democracy that we've witnessed, experienced, seen. Mm-hmm. And so much of your work pans out and puts that into historical context. Yeah. Why do you think that's so important?
So we think of, in media, we often think of the news as new. It's right there in the word. And I'm always telling my colleagues that very often what we think of as news is a new iteration of a much older problem. And so when we think about it contextually in that way, that changes the approach that we take to telling a story, to how we inform the public. If we look at, one of the things that I think is really significant is that we have, in recent years, had this heated conflict over immigration. We've also had a heated conflict over voter access and voter suppression, not just in the South, not just in the states of the former Confederacy, in Ohio, in Wisconsin, in New York State, and places that were firmly part of the Union are now caught up in this voter suppression dynamic. It's not coincidental that those two things have occurred, that we have those two conflicts at the same time. If you went back a century ago, it was the same thing. The underlying engine for this has been anxiety about the electorate, or rather the color and makeup of the electorate, which is a concern that has been in the United States since there have been electorates in the United States. So if we are approaching covering that story, we need to be able to understand the whole sweep of how we got to be where we are, or else we wind up covering things in ways that don't really do the topic justice.
So much of your point about the half-life of freedom and the ways in which we understand democracy is our relative infancy as a democracy. And then at the same time, the anxieties around the democracy that we've produced, right?
Yep.
Rights advanced, and then a real anxiety about that. How do we get to address the core of that issue? How do we address the anxiety and the fear that people have that ultimately is about power and the concerns about loss of power, loss of control, loss of resources? When people hold that so deep, how do we begin to address it?
So, I mean, there are two things I want to say about that. The first is that, broadly speaking, we were not supposed to be as democratic as we are right now. That all of these things, the two of us, sitting on a stage with a long list of accolades and degrees attached to our names, not supposed to happen. And that is a product, and I tell people, everywhere I go, at some point in the conversation that comes up, I mention to people that my father had a third grade education. He had a third grade education because in the place where he grew up, Hazelhurst, Georgia, if you've heard of it, it means you're my cousin. The place he grew up, that was as far as black people could go at the time that he grew up there. He had a third grade education, I have a PhD. That doesn't tell you very much about me, does tell you a great deal about him, does tell you a great deal about the people of his generation and subsequent ones who waged struggle before I was even born, for me to have the opportunities that I have. And they were waging that struggle against that very dynamic, that concept of who America is for, which has never been resolved. It's at the heart of, when you look at the Civil War, you kind of strip away the judgment and the, kind of indignation about the Confederacy, you are looking at a group of people who are fighting over a definition. It is a misunderstanding of a definition. So when you saw the Confederate flag taken down in the State House of Charleston after Dylann Roof murdered 9 people in the sanctuary of Emmanuel AME Church on Calhoun Street in Charleston, when that flag came down, if you look at the State House, there are all of these monuments there. Arguably, the flag was the least offensive of them. There's a monument to Ben Tillman, who was the former governor who had proudly participated in lynchings, bragged about this. It's a monument to Strom Thurmond, who ran on the presidential ticket of the Dixiecrat Party in 1948 on a platform of segregation, and more segregation, despite the fact that he had fathered a black child with a domestic worker who worked in his home. Those people are memorialized there. But the most loaded symbol on the State House grounds is also the one that people are least likely to notice, and that is the statue of George Washington. And the reason for that is that the Confederates claimed 1776. They believed that they were fighting for the continuation of what America was supposed to be. And there's a reasonable argument for them on their behalf. There's a reasonable argument that what they were arguing, that what they were fighting for was consistent. Now, there's arguments you can make on the other side of it too, but the point is that it's not a slam dunk. And so our ability to force democracy on an unwilling nation, a nation that has been largely unwilling to be democratic, is a testament to the resolve of the people who have waged all kinds of social struggles before us.
Why continue to push for democracy in that sense? Your family story is a family of hope, is a story of hope, but there are also stories of disillusionment.
Sure.
There are stories of why are we having these same debates over and over again? How do you navigate those kinds of twin impulses of hope and disillusionment? And what do you suggest for those of us who sometimes go back and forth in terms of how they're feeling about the state of affairs?
I think that's normal. And I think that when we present people, figures from the past as being completely resolved and completely courageous and never being ambivalent, then we do them a disservice. One of the reasons that I like Ava DuVernay's Selma is that Martin Luther King in that film is clearly a product. He is no stronger than the people around him. He frequently draws upon their counsel. When he is racked by self-doubt, he talks to his lieutenants, and he talks to Coretta, and he talks to the people around him. And that way we take away this sense of him as this person made of stone who knew, always the path forward. And so it's natural for us to feel that way. And I also think that the struggles behind us are bigger than the struggles in front of us, for the exact reasons that we just talked about. And the final thing is that, personally, when I think about what I care most about is that I have 2 daughters and I have 2 sons. And I never want to embarrass them by saying that there was this world that they were going to inherit, and I didn't do everything that I could to make it a more suitable place for them to live.
One of the most important aspects of the conversation around what we've been watching is the role of journalism. Journalists' role in documenting what's happening, journalists' role in amplifying what's happening. And I know that you've been involved in many conversations. I was listening to a podcast you did with Audie Cornish and some other journalists about the state of democracy and thinking about the profession and the profession's role in the health of democracy. And I wonder if you can talk about that. What are some of the debates happening within journalism?
Sure. So, there's this very 10,000-foot concept of journalism. We're here in service of democracy, et cetera, et cetera. But we seldom grapple with what exactly that means. And the way you know that was just how uncoordinated and flustered many outlets were in dealing with the last presidential administration, in dealing with the kind of blatantly anti-democratic, violation of norms. But, here's the example that or the kind of metaphor that I use to explain how American media has responded to the crisis of American democracy. So raise your hand if you played a sport. I mean that really, seriously. Like, raise your hand if you played a sport. Could be in high school, could be in college. All right. Okay, keep your hand up if you played volleyball, basketball, baseball/softball, tennis, or even boxing. Okay, now think about the first time that you competed against a left-hander. Right. Now, I'm left-handed, so this is an advantage for me. But when you compete against a left-hander, everything that you have learned, all of your conventional skills are wrong. You're doing the exact opposite. When a left-hander throws a curveball, it breaks down and in on you as opposed to breaking down and away. And so the entire orientation of everything is upside down. The democracy crisis is American media facing a left-hander. And so the dynamics of reporting where there's the idea that politicians are dishonest, sure, that everyone will try to sneak something by you or to try to pull a fast one, but to amplify propaganda and to utilize mechanisms that are supposed to inform the public for the dissemination of misinformation and disinformation is a different skill set. That is a left-handed skill set. So the media debated about whether or not to call something a lie, about whether or not to call something racist, about whether or not to interview people who were only going to tell you lies. And the answers to that were, the false answers, the wrong answers to that were rooted in the fact that they were operating on a set of presumptions about the impregnability of American democracy. And so if you have the 1776 perspective on American democracy, then you view this as an interesting, odd episode, of a, populist surge. Like, they used every kind of euphemism they could to try to get around, calling these things what they were. This is odd, this is interesting. If you have the American democracy began in 1965 approach to this, then it looks much more alarming as a development. And so the last thing I'll say, I think, that conveys how I viewed the way that much of, not all, but much of media responded to the crises that have emerged in recent years and that are still with us, even if they seem to be in a more latent form, is that I had a conversation with an editor who was very highly placed at a very powerful publication. Not hard to figure out what publication I'm talking about, but I'm not going to say it. It's a white man who had attended respected schools and had entered the profession of journalism. And I talked to him and said what I told you all. I said, listen, I think that the difference in how we see these questions is rooted in history. First, the big history of the country, but then also personal history. So because when I look at the forces, the militarized white supremacist elements that are now emboldened and out in public in American life, for me, as a person whose father had a third grade education and I have a PhD, I look at people whose objective is to return the next generation of my family to third grade education. That's the level of threat I see here. Whereas I think that you see it as just some disgruntled white guys in Ray-Bans.
Yeah.
Different vantage point.
And then one of the big things that's overlaying all of this is capitalism.
Sure.
And the profit motive within media.
Sure.
And the way in which the media, and I'm using a very broad description of media because we know we can parse it out, but I know that you'll do that in the answer, but this kind of unassuredness about how to respond to the last administration, but also this very complicated dynamic around eyeballs.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And increases of viewership, subscribership, et cetera, the decline of local news, the kind of need to find a way to feed journalism.
Right.
So talk to us about that additional layer and what that meant as editors tried to make decisions about how to respond and the tensions in that they were under.
That's, again, a point where history is useful because that conflict is not new. And, when Les Moonves said that Trump was, quote unquote, bad for America but great for CBS, beyond the cynicism of the statement, it was assuming that the press and American democracy were at opposite ends, so we had different interests, so that something could be good for the press while being bad for democracy, which is a contention that I reject. But the reason I say it's important to understand history is that that is the exact nature of the conflict of interest that enabled McCarthyism. Living my life like it's golden. All right, I'm good with that.
Well, Jill Scott, okay.
can go with Jill Scott here.
Right.
I was talking with Lynette earlier, and I said that, when I was in the earlier phase of my career where I was kind of moving from place to place, and I was thinking about like what kind of institution, what kind of university I would be at, and I was like, I struck upon my rule of thumb, which I was like, okay, I can live anywhere where Jill Scott performs semi-regularly. So it's like, oh.
And she'll be in Michigan in a couple of months.
It's like, yeah, there's an opening at the University of Wyoming. Like, has Jill been there? No.
Yes.
Jill has not been there.
Yes.
So,
Tickets purchased.
right. It's like we did the job talk, they made the offer, the dean is like on board. I was like, one last question. So in any case, I don't even remember the point that I was making. I have no. McCarthy.
Yeah.
McCarthy. Let me say this, McCarthy. So it's important. With Joseph McCarthy, editors realized two things fairly early. Mm-hmm. One is that he was lying. That didn't take a lot to realize. Also realized that when you put his name on the front page above the fold, you sold more newspapers. Mm. And so there was the sensationalism and the dishonesty, mm-hmm. but also the profit motive, which is what facilitated McCarthy's behavior for so long. One of the important points is that demagogues generally master one mode of communication. Some of them are great speakers, some of them are great with radio, some of them, in Joseph McCarthy's case, was great at manipulating the print press, but it's not shocking that he was taken down by the broadcast media, which was a different medium that he didn't understand how to manipulate, and had a different kind of set of incentives at that point in time. Ultimately, what McCarthy, what happened was that the editors came to terms with this conflict, and you started to see people fact-checking McCarthy in headlines, which was kind of splitting the difference. McCarthy accuses congressmen of communist ties, parenthetical, no evidence that this is true, which was the way of both getting the money and the attention that McCarthy brought, and disputing the falsehoods that he was trying to inject into the public via the press.
So you've written extensively about Trumpism, and the piece about McCarthy and Trumpism is a very fascinating one. And I wonder if you can comment on how the argument you make in one of your pieces is that the goalposts keep moving, mm-hmm. pushing the envelope. The cultural envelopes, the legal envelopes, mm-hmm. the norms of decency. And in that piece, you write, in either case, the McCarthy example provides at least one other insight. Fixating on the salesman misses the point. The problem is, and always has been, the size of the audience rushing to buy what he's selling. Mm-hmm. How do we think about the audience and the size of the audience, and what are you seeing in terms of the movement of audience mm-hmm. as it relates to Trump and Trumpism?
Mm-hmm. So Trump cracked a particular code in American life. There had been figures like him. You could go all the way through the history of the nation and find more and more figures that you say, oh, here's an element of Trump, or there's an element of Trumpism, or these kinds of things here. No one had been able to wield that and make it into an actual electorate, that could deliver the presidency. Everyone had to be refined or had to kind of be cleaned up. Or if you looked at Barry Goldwater in 1964, which is, a point of something else, another piece that I had written, he got obliterated by Lyndon Johnson in that election. But you can kind of see the seeds of Trumpism in that as well. And so having cracked the code of how you can mainstream, these volatile elements of American life that have always been there, right below the surface, it now is a formula that's out there. And so the analogy, I'm about to use another sports analogy, so be warned. The analogy I use is that, then I think it was Cassius Clay, this was before he changed his name to Muhammad Ali, but he fought a British heavyweight by the name of Henry Cooper early in his career. Completely uneventful fight, and Ali was anticipating kind of just breezing through this fight. And also Henry Cooper was just also known for bleeding profusely during fights. That would always happen. He would get hit and they'd have to stop the fight because he was bleeding. There was no real significance to this fight, except that, in one of the earlier rounds, Cooper unleashes this left hook that Ali never saw coming, and it knocked him flat on his butt for the first time. He was like, what was that? He gets up, beats Cooper, wins the fight. But the fact of it was that as great an athlete and as phenomenal a boxer as Muhammad Ali was, he never had a good defense against left hooks. And that didn't matter until he fought Joe Frazier, who fed him a diet of left hooks. He was like, I will throw left hooks all night. Or as I said, he threw left hooks like a man who was at work and was being paid by the piece, And so in the hands of a more formidable opponent, it had devastating consequences. That's Trumpism. So you had the left hook that sat you on your butt, and then you've kind of bounced back. But what happens when there are more deft practitioners of that art? And what becomes of the forces that he has wielded into an actual element of the society? We see now how the Republican Party has responded, to the presence of kind of its extreme elements, and whether Trump is losing his grip on the party or not, it doesn't necessarily correlate to those elements losing their grip on the party.
So you see a persistence of Trumpism.
Sure, but like McCarthyism, to go back to McCarthyism, Joseph McCarthy really never warranted having McCarthyism named after him, or having the movement named after him. He was just the most visible practitioner of something that was already happening in American society. We looked at HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. They did far more damage than McCarthy did. But he knew, he was the branding person. He was the visible person that you could attach something to. So Trump and Trumpism is simply a new iteration of a revanchist reactionary movement concerned with demographic totals in the society, and interested in preserving the already inordinate power of white people in the United States. You don't really need Trump to have Trumpism in that way.
One of the connective threads of your work is that you look at institutions broadly defined and think through their historical threads, and then think through the necessary and possible reforms, whether it's media, whether it's our politics, whether it's the practice and field of journalism. I wonder if you can talk about policing and police reform, because that's another institution and entity where you've spent a lot of time. You've got a Frontline documentary about it. I wonder if you can talk about the state of police reform, the ways in which the conversation has fractured in a variety of ways, and how you see it going forward.
Well, I mean, it's a very difficult circumstance because, we just saw the young man who was killed, was beaten to death by the police in Memphis. And in this instance, there was a question that was posed on CNN this morning that was kind of frustrating, which was, does it make a difference that all of these police officers were black? No. The fact of it is that this is institutional behavior. The victims are disproportionately likely to be black. And so that's where the element of this is, that You can have a system that's composed of black people and still behave on the principles of white supremacy. That both of those things are possible. And so with that, we have mass shootings. We just saw, 2 of them in the same county, the same town in California, on the same day. And we don't really do anything about it. We continue in this cycle. And so I don't think that means that nothing will ever happen, but I think that it will take extraordinary effort and extraordinary timing and extraordinary coordination and resolve in order for something to happen. I think the same thing goes for police reform. Those 2 things are not unrelated, because as I've said, the most charitable case you can make for the levels of aggression you see in American policing, where any given year we can expect 1,000 to 1,200 civilians to die in the course of interactions with the police, which is an astounding number of people. The most charitable case you can make for police in that regard, American police in that regard, is that they live in a society and they operate in a society in which there are more guns than people. And if you want to produce a paranoid police force, that's pretty much a good way to do it. And so those things are the kind of bigger macro, and that's before we get to the dynamics of race. That's before we get into the dynamics of the way that safety has become a mantra that facilitates any behavior or rationalizes any kind of behavior on the part of police, and all the other kind of cultural and historical legacies that are wrapped up in that. So when you look at it from that vantage point, it's not that hard to see why it has been difficult to achieve police reform, which is largely stalled. But I will say this, if we were to think about, the Space Invaders, that story that Derek Bell wrote about what would happen if aliens came and took all the black people in America, what if they made an offer, like, we'll give you gold and cures for illnesses and all these things, but in exchange we want you to give us all your black people. Like, what would happen? And he concludes that America would be like, sold.
And it's an essay on Faces at the Bottom of the Well.
Faces at the Bottom of the Well,
one of his books.
But if we took that story forward and said, what would happen a week after, or 2 weeks after, or 6 months after all the black people were gone, my contention is that one of the things that people would notice is, like, did you realize how violent our police are? Because we think of this as a black problem, which makes it easy for us to dismiss it as a small problem. But American police every year kill a hell of a lot of white people. Disproportionate to our population, they kill our percentage of a population, they kill black people, sure. But in absolute numbers, they kill white people in numbers that should be horrifying and sickening. But it goes unnoticed. And so there's that kind of odd paradox wherein time, and my friend Heather McGee talks about this in the book The Sum of Us. There's these dynamics where lots of people suffer, but because if you only highlight the black people suffering, you're able to have people dismiss the problem out of hand as something that's not really worth investing in.
So how do you have political debates that allow for a recognition of the disproportionality and yet make a universal argument for why a particular policy reform is important? How do you honor the specificity of a experience of a marginalized group, but then also make the case of its larger implications?
Yeah, I think that's important. Like, one of the things that happened where I was covering juvenile justice issues in Georgia, which had passed this draconian set of laws about juvenile offenders, which was so poorly written that in some instances that, if a 15-year-old and a 28-year-old robbed a liquor store together, the 15-year-old would likely get more time than the 28-year-old. Like, that's how the law was written. And what they realized in short order was that they were locking up a lot of white kids. and a lot of low-income white kids. And that facilitated a coalition, even though it was disproportionate in the black and brown communities. The fact was that there were a lot of white families that were saying that, my son did something wrong, but not certainly, on the scale that he's being punished, and that these laws, really are having this, this terrible impact. And so I think that we organize around the Venn overlap in these places. And that doesn't get us all the way there. We still have to deal with the reality of race. Like when we talk about healthcare, if we were talking about providing healthcare, quality healthcare to low-income people, you would disproportionately provide quality healthcare to black people, since a larger proportion of us are low income. The tricky issue gets to be when you find middle class and even upper middle class black people who wind up with the similar health outcomes to poor black people because of the racism in the system. That's not a class dynamic. That's a straight up racial dynamic. And that doesn't fall into the Venn overlap. That's the place where you actually have to organize around that specifically as an issue that affects your community.
And we just had New York Times reporter Linda Villarosa here. And Linda Villarosa's new book really takes on this issue. So folks can look at the Ford School website and Wallace House as well, in terms of the event that we did last week on Linda's new book on race and health. I want to ask, before we turn it over to the audience, I want to do just some quick takes on a number of topics that you've written about that I think people would be really interested to hear. Why did you leave Twitter?
The shortest answer is I just didn't want to hang out in any club where Donald Trump was. That was just kind of, that was mostly it. But okay, the more substantial answer, though, as a journalist, is that, Twitter, we have this weird symbiotic relationship with Twitter, as journalists, and we've never stopped to evaluate it. So when, so I have young journalists who are in my classes and who are in the journalism school. They are eager to build a following on social media, and with good reason. Publications and news outlets are looking at people's profiles, and if they have a huge following, sure, that gives you an advantage in an interview. And if you are a person who knows a whole lot about a particular subject and you create a thread that goes viral, there will be an editor reaching out asking if you can write about that. Or there may be a book editor asking if you're interested in doing a book. Like all sorts of ways that people have come up via social media. Somebody can DM you if they want to give you information about something. Sources can contact you. We never thought about the trade-off.
Because what you described sounds like total value add for the field of journalism. What was the trade-off?
Well, among other things, we were operating in a disinformation ecosystem, in a system that made it very easy to spread falsehoods. The other things were, we had, especially it became obvious when Elon Musk took over, we had kind of golden handcuffs. So if people started behaving in ways that were really inimical to the interests of journalism, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to leave? Because then you're leaving your brand behind. And so that was the question I got a lot that really kind of disturbed me. Like, were you worried about losing visibility when you left Twitter? And I was like, no. At the end of the day, I'm a journalist, I'm a historian, I do the work that I do. I don't need, hey, here's an interesting picture of a hawk that I took flying outside my neighborhood. I'm going to post this, which is fun, but I did show you the picture of the hawk.
You did show me the picture.
It's a pretty amazing picture, actually. I'll email it out to all of you. But it's like a Cooper's hawk that was like right outside my window, and I got a picture of it diving, which, but that doesn't really make up for the other side of what's happening on that platform. You know, especially when Musk started doing things like banning journalists for writing articles he didn't like. Like, I don't understand how any of us reconciled with participating in that platform after that. And the last thing I'll say about that is that I am rarely confident about future outcomes. I have no doubt that I'll be proven right about my decision to leave Twitter as a journalist.
Wow. You referenced Derek Bell earlier, and I want to ask you about critical race theory and the ways in which it's being used within discussions of what's happening in K through 12
Right.
institutions, K through 12 schools, its linkages to a larger conversation around structural racism and how we should be talking about that, the role of history, all of the kind of historical analyses you've been able to provide. I wonder if you can talk about this very complicated minefield that we're now all in as educators around discussions around race in education.
Sure. The answer I can give is that the biggest practitioner of critical race theory in the United States right now is Ron DeSantis. Because if you know what critical race theory says, and you know what Derek Bell was arguing, he said that in an allegedly colorblind society, that the language of anti-discrimination would be deployed toward the means of bolstering discrimination. And that is exactly what has happened. So when the NHL was trying to diversify its employment ranks, and it put out that job listing that said they were particularly interested in diverse candidates, and Ron DeSantis went after them saying they were discriminating against white people, despite the fact that the NHL's workforce was 81% white. And white people are only 60% of the population of the United States. So in order to achieve fairness, you have to remain discriminatory. But that was exactly what the theory predicts. And so, in the hard sciences, the validity of a theory is measured, not so much by how it explains stuff you already know, but its ability to predict things that haven't happened yet. Critical race theory really anticipated the behavior that we have seen from an entire reactionary wing of conservatives who have tried to position themselves such that white people are the disempowered class in the United States.
How do we navigate that? And then another really interesting discussion, I think, in higher education is this question of ideological diversity. It's something we talk about at the University of Michigan. I'm sure you talk about it at Columbia. And I wonder if you can talk about how we encourage ideological diversity and at the same time think about how we're navigating all these very complicated political dynamics in terms of what we just talked about with critical race theory. Can they coexist? A conversation around inequality and diversity.
They should, because what's happening is that people are kind of targeting a particular set of ideas and saying, in all kinds of violations of free speech, saying that these ideas are not valid and they're not. There's no place for them. Or even in Florida, they're saying that these ideas are illegal to be taught. And so those are straight First Amendment issues. At the same time, I think that it's important that universities be intellectually diverse, that we should have people from all sorts of perspectives thinking about questions or taking approaches to social phenomena or phenomena in the hard sciences or anywhere else. That I think that we should have an open door for all of that. Where I part company with the intellectual diversity crowd, though, is the attempt to hijack the language of struggles for people who were physically not allowed to exist in these institutions. When we go far enough back with most institutions in the United States, we find people who were not allowed to participate. And we have to actively do something different to overcome the legacy of those communities being excluded. That is not the same as saying that you want more supply-side thinkers in your economics department. You know, those are different things, even if that is a arguably worthwhile pursuit.
Let me open it up for questions from the audience. So I encourage those of you here with us to come to one of the stand microphones here in the aisles if you have a question. And those of you tuning in virtually can tweet your questions to hashtag Wallace House, and we will try to alternate between the mics and our questions coming in from social media.
I'd like to pick up on some of your recent themes and your comments about lies and disinformation in the media. As we know, this, as you pointed out, what we call news often is just a new iteration of something in the past. I'd be interested in your comments on how significant the lies and disinformation today are compared to 100 years ago, 200 years ago. There have always been lies spread through media, and how is today different than the past? If you could say more about that, I'd be interested.
I think that's a really important question. When you looked at, especially the interesting kind of point, and one of my colleagues brought this up, when you looked at the kind of press that existed around the time of the Bill of Rights, it was entirely tabloid. One of the reasons, by the way, one of the reasons that people did not believe the allegations about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings was because newspapers published all kinds of wild things that didn't necessarily have any basis in the truth, that were scurrilous, and in this case it turned out to be true, but it was in a context of all these things that were like, we think this person is doing this, let's publish. And so at the time that there's a amendment to protect the free press, that is really a leap of faith, that the press is actually going to evolve into something that is worthy of the mantle of protecting democracy. And by the same token, if you look at Kathy Roberts Ford, who is a journalism scholar, has a really good anthology that I've been recommending everywhere I go called Journalism and Jim Crow. And in it, historians very often use newspapers as sources, but we don't examine the newspapers themselves, not nearly as often. And this book examines the role that newspapers played in upholding Jim Crow and segregation, and who the editors were, who the publishers were, what kind of causes they were involved in, what kinds of civic organizations they were connected to, what politicians they supported, and so on. And so institutionally, we get to see just the very flawed history and the anti-democratic history of the American press. And so there's always been this. I think the difference is, at this point, volume and scale. Because typically, if you owned a printing press, you were a fairly well-off person, at the time of the Constitution was ratified. You now can, when we looked at the disinformation around COVID, and so there was just a handful of people that were creating most of the falsehoods that were bouncing around in that ecosystem. And we have a two-way system now of communication. Unlike television, unlike radio, social media allows people to communicate with large numbers of people at one time. So when we say broadcast, broadcast is an agricultural term. It's like if you took seeds and you were literally casting them broadly, that was what the word broadcast meant before the advent of radio and television. And so it was a metaphor. You were doing effectively what a farmer was doing, spreading something out into the world. And now, that idea is almost quaint because there's information being cast in all directions by all people, and the largest and loudest voices are not necessarily correlative to the most accurate or truthful. And so I think that's one of the most distinguishing factors, but it's a problem of scale, not of type. It's just a very new iteration of the old problem.
So when we think about the half-life of freedom, the other kind of huge institutional player that we then have to take into account are technology companies.
Sure.
And I wonder if you can talk to us about their role in this conversation, because it's not just between the media, the presses, et cetera, and the audience. Now there is a kind of third party that has a huge role in dissemination and amplification. So I wonder if you can talk to us about what I think all of us are grappling with, which is how do you make sense of social media and what needs to happen as it relates to its relationship to democracy and upholding democracy. Is there a responsibility there, and what is it?
Yeah, so like when we have these conversations about the business model and the demise of newspapers and publications, and we don't even conceive of talking about the role of tech in it. We don't even talk about the remunerative responsibilities of tech, which have made billions and billions of dollars from content that they don't pay for. And so in Europe, this conversation is much more advanced. In Australia, this conversation is much more advanced. In the United States, with the Darwinian mindset that we tend to have here, that's not even something that we would conceive of asking. But also news has to exist. If we had any doubt about that, the pandemic should have clarified it. And for lots of reasons, lots of social and civic reasons, lots of political reasons. We find that with the demise of local news outlets, you also get lower levels of political participation. So there's a correlation between those things. So news has to exist, so we have to have an honest assessment of what has to happen in order for news to exist. And that will probably involve some sort of regulation and probably some form of taxation.
Yes.
Dean Cobb, thank you so much for coming here.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask you a question about patriotism, and in particular, whether you think the media has any role in sustaining or building or growing patriotism. And I guess I'd like to ask the question this way. This MLK Day, I spent a little time thinking about Langston Hughes' poem about, America was never this for me, and yet America will be. Or if we think about Martin Luther King's Letters from a Birmingham Jail, one of the, I think, distinctive parts of this understanding of the civil rights movement is the ability to call people to a fuller practice of a set of ideals that are beautiful and yet not practiced, right? And to be able to hold those two things at the same time. The ideals are beautiful, we are not there, we need to work towards them. This, of course, happens at a time when the media unblushingly and maybe even, proudly understood itself as, a partner in advancing a view of America and a view of American ideals and, and a view of the superiority and of the example that America could be to other peoples in the world. We, I think, don't have that understanding of journalism now. Have we also lost something by understanding journalism, primarily as a way of finding fault, as opposed to a way, in addition, of building up? Or would you say that my characterization of journalism is incorrect? Thank you.
So no, I mean, I don't think that, like, finding fault is important. I mean, I think that that is a crucial function. In some ways, we're like, the doctors, for the American public, or for at least for, American democracy. If you see, some sort of concerning result on a lab test, you want to tell that person. But you tell that person in order for them to be able to do something about it. And so that's a crucial element, of what the media does. Now, maybe paradoxically, I do feel that media has a role to play in inspiring patriotism. And what I mean by that is simply a sense of civic ownership and responsibility for the person next to you, metaphorically speaking, and the people who will live in this society after us. We've had the language of patriotism by and large hijacked, such that the people who invaded the Capitol on January 6th referred to themselves proudly as patriots. But we did not hear that language referred to those police officers in the Capitol Police who, despite being overwhelmed, stood their ground to try to keep those people out. We don't frequently talk about the level of patriotism that was required to fight on behalf of a country that would not let you vote. There are black and brown people who died for a nation that would not let them vote in their lifetimes. And so that, I think, is a marker of patriotism that we don't generally acknowledge. And the last part of it, I think, is about, the kind of American sense of itself. I think it's very important that we separate the idea of patriotism from the idea of superiority, because that's jingoism. And we've conflated those two terms. And, especially around the kind of idea of being exceptional, like, American exceptionalism, which is this idea we hear popping up all the time. And my response is always the same, that being exceptional is like being rich or being good looking, which is that it's far better for other people to say that about you than it is for you to say that about yourself. So, like, nobody really admires the person who walks in and says, I'm rich and I'm good looking, even if objectively speaking, they are rich and good looking. And so that's, my perspective on that.
I see we have a question here.
Jelani, my name is Lillian, and I went to your lunch yesterday, if you remember, and just really thank you again. Something that stood out from the talk yesterday at the lunch was a quote you said about how those who are probably the ones not feeling like imposters are probably the imposters themselves.
Yeah.
And that has stuck with me, and I want to just ask about sort of coming as an Asian American female. I love that you wrote about hip hop. I'm a really, really passionate dancer. And there was quite a debate over Asian American dancers back when Black Lives Matter happened. A lot of them tried to create music videos and dance choreography to tell a story about, Black struggle, Black rights, Black activism. And there was a lot of backlash on that, on these Asian American choreographers doing that. As someone who's really passionate about my Black brothers and sisters, especially like you're saying how your dad had a third-grade education. I feel fortunate that my dad didn't, but seeing some of the Black dancers in my studios, they have parents who never had an education. So I wonder, as Asian American writers, Asian American, people in general, or journalists, how do other minority groups help support Black folks, Black activists, Black journalists, just anyone in the Black community? Just really wanting to do justice towards that, and any advice you have on that.
Okay. So just to clarify your point, we were saying about imposters. So the line is this. It is my observation that actual imposters never suffer from imposter syndrome. So if you suspect that you don't belong someplace, that is likely evidence that you do. And so,
To clarify on that, I feel incredible imposter syndrome when I'm trying to study or talk about or support other minority groups. So that was my point of the whole
yeah.
quote.
Yeah, but I think it's important though. I think it's important because, and this is one other thing that I really, a type of behavior I really did not like on social media, that everything became appropriation. Now, there is actual appropriation. Like when you looked at the black musicians who were not allowed to perform in white clubs, and then white musicians who stole their material and got rich off of it, or Little Richard's music being stolen and produced by other artists. There's a long history of that. There's cultural appropriation in the British Museum, and that's physical appropriation at gunpoint, for artifacts from other cultures. I don't believe people growing up and being influenced by popular culture from various different communities constitutes appropriation. And I feel very strongly about that. And one of the other things that was very surprising to me was that, so I taught a course on hip hop, the history of hip hop, at Spelman College, actually, early on. And this was entirely black class. And finally, like the middle of the semester, somebody raised their hand and they had a question. They wanted to know why I kept mentioning Latinos. And I was like, what do you mean? It's like, you keep saying black and Latino, black and Latino. And I was like hip hop is black. And I was like, oh my God, what? Have I not succeeded in anything in this class? I was like, the people who created hip hop were black, by and large, West Indian, a lot of people from the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, and this is the Bronx in the 1970s, a not small number of working class white kids. Like, that is where hip hop comes from. The problem is that people don't know that history. And what the dynamics were that put all of those people in the same community in that time frame. And so I would encourage you to keep doing the thing that you do, and to be in dialogue with people. That's important, and to be respectful, of other people's cultures and other people's traditions. But I don't want to erect our own Jim Crow signs, to keep everybody else out. I don't think that benefits anybody.
We have a question here.
Thank you, Dr. Cobb and Dr. Watkins, for this conversation. I just wanted to ask, your perspective, Dr. Cobb, on what appears to be the Supreme Court on the verge of reversing years of precedent about the legality of affirmative action. What does the future look like from your perspective in terms of not just increasing diversity, to the point you made earlier about the difference between institutional diversity or intellectual diversity and actually making reparations for past exclusion, physical exclusion of specific groups of people? How do we talk about that, those policies in a future where potentially affirmative action will be, illegal as the law of the land?
I'm holding out for Clarence Thomas having a last-minute conversion. Like, I'm preparing to visit him with a dish of catfish and grits. Like, brother, let's sit down and have a conversation. Let's talk this through. So I think that what's happened, my colleague Nick Lemon did a really good piece on this in the New Yorker, is that the Supreme Court has never really fully been okay with affirmative action. And if you go all the way back to Bakke, in, was it 1977, 78, even then, the language around it continued to hedge and hedge and hedge. I mean, the people in this audience know this better than probably most. Having had one of the landmark, cases around affirmative action fought here. And so, in some ways, this is a kind of predictable end. If it winds up being that, it winds up being a predictable end to what we've seen happening over the course of these years. I think that institutions that are committed can find creative ways to still foster, diverse communities, and at their institutions, on their campuses. I think that most institutions will not. I think that when we look at the University of California system, what happened after the demise of affirmative action in that state was that the diversity of those campuses, particularly as it related to Black and brown communities, plummeted. I think we should anticipate that reality. The other side of it, and I don't think of this as a silver lining at all, I think of this as maybe perhaps predictive, is that we don't consider why affirmative action came about. Affirmative action was, by and large, there were some things that kind of hinted toward it in the Johnson administration, but it's by and large a product of Richard Nixon. And, if you're asking why Richard Nixon would be a proponent of affirmative action, he was looking at people like Stokely Carmichael and saying, here you have this brilliant person who wants to burn down the system. If we were really smart, the system would have found a place for him. If he had an opportunity to become a lawyer and open a private practice, he would have paid taxes and gone on to live his life. Now you have all of these generations, all of these significantly talented Black people who are burning up American cities. And there was a kind of cynical ploy to give just enough to create a kind of, social equilibrium. And that's what affirmative action was planned to do. But it's like if you put a pot on the stove and it starts to boil, and then you take the pot off the stove and it stops boiling, most people would see some sort of causal relationship between those two things. But where we are now is saying, let's put that pot back on the stove and see what happens. So I think that the gradual closing off of opportunity will create more social upheaval of exactly the sort that gave rise to affirmative action in the first place.
We have time for 2 more questions, yes.
I'll be very quick.
Dean Cobb, I have a question that is just under the surface of your conversation around patriotism. And it also relates to an introduction. You did a wonderful introduction to the book Victory is Assured, about the writings of the late Stanley Crouch. And in that introduction, you reference a notion of Black Americans being essential Americans coming from Albert Murray, and you contrast that with another view. And I wondered if you could speak of that and also comment on where is that, if at all, in today's conversation.
I mean, it's interesting, because in writing that piece, I was thinking about Stanley. I don't know how many people here knew Stanley Crouch. If you knew Stanley Crouch, it meant you were arguing with Stanley Crouch. I met him when I was arguing, when I was 25 years old. And I continued arguing with him up until my last interaction with him was probably a year or so before he passed away. And so Stanley felt, and if you looked at his writing, he felt that there was this theme of far from Black people being kind of alienated from America, that Black people had been like the active ingredient in what made America America. And he had been influenced by Albert Murray in that thinking that they were the kind of what he called omni-Americans, or the essential Americans. I think that there is a kind of low-grade version of that has survived Murray and Crouch, that people think of themselves as being a fundamental part of the United States. I don't think they took it where they took it. Most people take it where certainly like Albert Murray was writing against the Black Power movement. He was writing against the critique that black people were effectively an internal colony in the United States. There was a lot of social economic evidence, to support that contention. And so I don't think that people go as far as they did, but I think that probably, Murray and Ralph Ellison, for that matter, and Crouch speak for a fairly significant plurality of black life in making those arguments now.
Yes, last question.
I'm just kind of curious, but what's like your definition of journalistic integrity?
So first of all, there's a lot more, actually the Society of Professional Journalists has a much better definition if you go to their website than I do, and I'll borrow from them. But I think journalistic integrity involves the disinterested reporting in the public interest of information that helps people make the fundamental decisions about their lives and that causes no more harm than necessary.
Well, say it again.
I can't.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the nice things about having Jelani here is that every conversation that you've participated in over the past day they've been very different conversations. When Jelani was with the Knight Wallace Fellows last night, we were deep in the journalism weeds and talking a lot about the need for journalists to better understand U.S. history. And when he was with Celeste and Dominique at the Ford School, it was about public policy. And the questions here, there were questions raised here that drew more on history and seeing the side of you that's an analyst. And so it's been wonderful to see you move through those different spaces and give so richly in each of them. So I thank you for being here for that. And I thank you all for your questions. I just want to underscore again how important it is to have somebody like Jelani Cobb in journalism. I stand here on the podium at our events and we talk so much about the central role of journalism in our society, but it doesn't mean that the critique of journalism isn't necessary, and that one of the things we're doing all the time at Wallace House is talking with the fellows who come through our program about what we need to do to make journalism better, where it falls short, the things that we miss, the questions that we don't ask, the history that we don't understand. And so to have someone like Jelani who fully understands the ethics of how you're supposed to conduct yourself as a journalist, but who can press us all to be better in the field and in society is not a small thing. And so I feel a bit jealous for the students of the Columbia School of Journalism, but I know that our profession will be stronger for the years that he spends there putting students through thinking more deeply about what it means to be a journalist and how to find their place and their voice and their values in the world. And we know here, a lot of you I see come to our events all the time, what that means. What we're trying to do as Wallace House when we have these events is to make sure people understand this fragility of our democracy, that if we don't understand and support and uphold journalism, we're weakening that structure that we all need for for our democracy to be strong. And so Celeste, who is like my partner in crime here at the university, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
For
Pleasure.
leading this
It was an absolute
conversation.
honor. Thank you so much.
And please follow the Ford School events page, follow the Wallace House events page. If you're not on our newsletters, please sign up. We will look forward to seeing you back here in March when Chris Wallace comes. More information about that soon. And go out and support some form of journalism. And we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.